Hey everybody, it's 3 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First thing, does anybody have any announcements? Oh, Professor Mullen, yes.
Tomorrow from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. on the second and third floor of ABS is the Senior Research Poster Session. So everyone is invited if you want to learn more about the students' senior research projects that are amazing and have them curated by the researcher themselves.
Right, so 2 to 4 tomorrow afternoon in ABS on the second floor in the big open hallway will be the Senior Research Poster Session. So if you didn't hear that, please do come check out the posters. Anything else? A week from today, holiday party, right? Okay, yeah, all right, so anyway. Yeah, okay, thumbs up, 12 to 2, okay. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our speaker today. So Chris West is joining us today. She's is the Assistant Regional Wildlife Biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife out of the Jonesboro office, so far down east. She has 30 years experience working with wildlife in Maine and has previously worked for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the Biodiversity Research Institute, Maine Natural History Observatory, Department of Marine Resources, and the University of Maine on avian, marine benthic, macroinvertebrate, phytoplankton, and vegetation surveys throughout the US and Canada. She specializes in coastal avian ecology, conservation, and management with an emphasis on shorebirds and salt marsh obligate bird species. Chris is interested in the feeding ecology of shorebirds, and she's designed and implemented a marine benthic and macroinvertebrate survey to monitor the changes in macroinvertebrate abundance on 2 Washington County mudflats before, during, and after shorebird migration stopovers. And that's one of the things she's going to talk about today. And lastly, she's collaborated with many fellow biologists, stakeholders, researchers, and academic colleagues to make the best management decisions on conserving Maine's wildlife. So with that, thank you, and welcome, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Is my thing on? It's a green light. Oh, maybe it needs to be put up a little bit. Sorry. How about now? Is that good? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about the importance of Maine's mudflats at today's seminar. Thank you for inviting me. As Sarah mentioned, I'm the Assistant Regional Wildlife Biologist out of the Jonesboro office for Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I have actually over 30 years experience working for wildlife in Maine and elsewhere throughout the US. I've studied organisms as small as Pseudonychiae, which is a phytoplankton, all the way up to as large as moose, and everything in between. So I'm kind of reiterating everything that Sarah said, but I participated in a lot of avian and mammal, freshwater and marine benthic, macroinvertebrates, herptiles, phytoplankton, vegetation surveys for all those US Fish and Wildlife, biodiversity, Maine Natural History, Acadia National Park, and University of Maine. One of the things I forgot to tell everybody is I used to work at Maine Maritime Academy. I was here for a few years. I was actually administrative assistant and coordinator for what was the continuing education department, which is now CPMD up in Bucksport. So I was here for a few years, and I'm grateful for that opportunity because I was able to learn what you guys do here. And I also added another skill set to my toolbox, mostly on the administrative end of things and learning what mariners do and the training that they need to get out in the workforce. And like Sarah said, I specialize in coastal avian ecology and conservation management. And as you can see here, this some of the things I got to do through the years. Some of these pictures are from Idaho. I spent many winters out there catching purple sandpipers, which is that upper left-hand picture. And that's me looking for bands on harlequin ducks on the lower left. So I spent, I don't know, probably like 5 or 6 winters out there doing that. And then, of course, I'm wrangling a duck. I'm not choking it. I'm actually measuring it. And a lot of this stuff was like off the offshore islands. And then I've done some bald eagle stuff, bear study, Canada lynx. That was actually a Canada lynx kitten den that I found with 5 kittens, which was huge. One of my first positions at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, I was a contract worker 30 years ago, and I had set up the first volunteer network for oil spill cleaning in the state, and I worked with Maine Department of Environmental Protection on that. And then since then, they hired me to do bird surveys. Like I said, I worked on bear dens in the wintertime when they had cubs. And then I had done work up in northern Maine on the Canada lynx. Another position I had, I was a crew lead on the oiling rates team, assessing birds for oil after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And I was down there for 8 months in the Gulf of Mexico. So there was a lot of days out on the boat. You can see me in my lovely Mustang suit that was extra, extra, extra large. And so anyways, and then the upper picture is me getting ready to look for shorebirds. And then we also did a project this past winter with a PhD student from Canada, fitting solar satellite tags on mallards and black ducks to follow their movements throughout the year. And that's what that middle picture is. And I always have lovely hair, sorry. It just comes with the... And again, I said I worked for Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and this is our mission statement, and this is kind of what we adhere to as biologists for the state. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife was established around the 1880s, and it was mainly to control game populations. Back then, there weren't a lot of regulations on hunting and harvesting animals, so they kind of set that into place. It was Maine Fish and Game at the time. And now we do habitats, non-game species. So it's kind of blossomed into the department we are today. And I'll get into, we have regional biologists, and we also have the wildlife research assessment section. And that's actually where I got my start, was doing mostly research on a lot of these species. So there's 20 of those biologists throughout the state that just study mammals, birds, reptiles, and invertebrates. And these are the regions. The one that's bolded is my region, which is primarily Hancock and Washington counties. And there are 7 management regions within this division, the Wildlife Management Division. And some of the things I do is we manage the wildlife management areas. We do wildlife and habitat management, research and data collection, and animal damage control. A little too much of that. And then one of the things we do is manage the wildlife management areas. And throughout the state, there's over 60 wildlife management areas with about 106,000 acres set aside for these management areas. And the smaller districts up there, I don't know if you can see that, but like the 19 and the 20 and the 28, and those are the wildlife management districts, and those are primarily for deer. And so when we're issuing deer permits, antlerless deer permits, we kind of go by those districts. So that it breaks it down even more. And as I was saying, we have wildlife management areas, and in my region, there's 12. We're working on number 13, so it's pretty exciting. And then some of these units, like up in Cobscook Bay, Pleasant Bay, they're not just one piece of land, it's many little parcels. And the reason why we do that, especially in Cobscook Bay and Pleasant Bay, we want to maintain that access to the water, whether it's recreational or commercial clamming. People are allowed to hunt and trap on our wildlife management areas. We have to issue permits just so we know how many people are in these areas. And then, of course, we have many coastal islands that are wildlife management areas that we keep track of. Another thing that I do as a biologist is we do DEP permit review. These are areas that fall under the Natural Resources Protection Act. So DEP gets a project proposal. It's usually shoreline stabilization, docks, piers. Sometimes we get forest management plans. So we just have to go through this criteria and make sure these sensitive habitats are not going to be directly impacted by these projects. So we try to mitigate that impact, and we offer suggestions, recommendations on how to mitigate that. So we have certain guidelines that we have to follow in order to give those recommendations to people. Another thing that we do is conservation easement monitoring. This is one that we just did recently, Eastern Nubble up in Cutler. It's this beautiful piece of property that this family has turned over. And what we do is every 3 years we go out and monitor these properties, make sure they're in compliance. And then we have some federal ones that we have to do on a yearly basis. We have 23 of these conservation easements in the region, and some of them are coastal islands. Some of them are privately owned, but some of them are also owned by local land trusts. So we partner with a lot of those land trusts and landowners. And statewide, there's over 100 with about 13,000 acres that are set aside in conservation easement total. Like I said, we do a lot of animal damage control and technical assistance. Get a lot of deer and beaver calls, so we try to help people out if they have a plugged culvert and they're a couple of things that have happened, like their yard is flooding. We give them some information on how to live with the beavers as much as we can. So we deploy or either help them with setting up beaver deceivers, which is to keep the water flowing through, whether it's a culvert. We also issue permits for dam removals, just in case if it's backing up. And then because we live in blueberry country, we get a lot of bear calls in the spring when they're coming out of torpor. They're very hungry. They go to the blueberry barrens because there's beehives. And some of our blueberry growers will put electric fencing, which is that picture up on top. Some of them don't. So when they don't, and they put them near the woods, the bears love the beehives. So, and then sometimes we get calls on dead moose. So we usually have to do a necropsy to find out why the moose what happened to it and everything. And public appearances, like I'm here today. We do school groups, fairs, private groups, land trusts. And then another part of my job is disease monitoring. We work with these folks here. Right now, we are monitoring high-pathic avian influenza. This is the time of the year where it increases, believe it or not. And it's partially because these birds are congregating. They're all together. Just last week, 2 weeks ago, we had to eliminate a flock of domestic birds. A third of them tested positive with HIPAT. So it's a pretty serious thing. One of the things they asked sea duck hunters this winter is to not kill female common eiders, because a lot of the nesting common eiders, females, 15% of them died from avian influenza this past spring. So it's a pretty serious issue. We're also looking into skunk adenovirus, which impacts skunks and also porcupines. There's an incident in Penobscot where these porcupines were all hanging out together and all of them died, and it was from the skunk adenovirus. We also look at what's happening with our moose population, and that's on the deer is cutaneous fibroma, which happens, it's like skin warts. And usually it's when the deer herd is like really close together. It's a virus that gets spread through the deer herd. And that's us swabbing a duck. We do terrible things to ducks. So we were swabbing it for high path and testing our wild populations this past winter. And that's my lovely supervisor with, I think, a moose brain in his hand. We were looking for a brain worm. And then the fun stuff, data collection, research, and monitoring. I was fortunate to help out this past summer, put a satellite tag on a great blue heron down in Deer Isle, so that was fun. Again, you know, with the ducks, we did the same thing, these little solar backpacks that they get so we can monitor their movements. Do a lot of offshore bird surveys. And then that's my supervisor and I, we were flying over the northern part of our region. We were looking for deer wintering areas, and the easiest way to do it is if there's deep enough snow, we know that the deer are going to be yarding up. Not that we get a lot of snow on the coast, but occasionally we do. And when they had those limiting factors, they tried to yard up in under softwood cover, usually cedars and stuff. So that's the best way to try to document that. And we just happened to have one day last winter that we could fly, so that's what we did. And again, that's a coworker of mine taking apart a deer, probably doing a necropsy, field necropsy. So I thought I'd put up some funny sayings, because mud, there are a lot of idioms and sayings, and I could check off all of those. So what does mud have to do with it? And I'm going to talk about the habitat a little bit, and then my relationship, what I've had to wallow in it, I guess. So here's a little bit of I'm sure your professors have gone over, you're very intertidal zone folks. So tidal mudflats are generally, it's a very gentle slope, you know, almost level it seems like, but there is a little bit of a slope going on. There's some fine sediment getting deposited when the tide comes in. All the fine particles kind of sort down and everything. And these sites are usually like low energy, not a lot of wave action going on. And these habitats tend to get overlooked, but yet they're important. They support important ecosystem services. And then since the glacial retreat of the last ice age, the sea levels have been adjusting in the intertidal zone, so it's a pretty dynamic ecosystem as well. So these, I mean, it's approximate that they formed after the ice age, but they see high temperature and salinity fluctuations with the tides. Generally, they're located in sheltered areas like bays, coves, estuaries. And then North America has like 15.5% of the total global extent of the mudflat intertidal zone. And these are the different types of flats. And I don't know if you drive through and you could see, like, some of them are just plain old mud. Some of them are like a little bit of sand, gravel. Some of those gravel ones tend to be see more wave action. Again, the sorting of the particles and stuff. And then some of these other ones, the seaweed-covered flats, mussel bar, algal flats. And then there are many classifications of tidal channels and creeks. I just didn't want to get into it right now, but there are quite a few. So this is the map of our area. The dark blue shows where our intertidal mudflats are. Like I said, they're not all mud. Some of them are sand, gravel flats, but kind of shows you like we have quite a bit going on just in this area. Here's a quick little diagram. Not all mudflats are bordered by saltgrass. Some of them, salt marshes rather. Some of them are upland edges. Some of them are rocky. But this is kind of gives you a little bit of shows you like what's going on with the mudflat when the tide goes up. It's completely covered underwater. Tide goes out and it exposes that mud. And then here's the you can see where the mud and the particles, the clay and the silt is usually what makes up the mud flats, and then you have the bigger grain size for the gravel and sand flats. And here's a lovely mud flat in down East Maine, and in the background you could actually see them clamming. I think it's Jonesport, someplace like that. So now we'll get into the economic importance. These are the species that are harvested that contribute to Maine's economy. I think I captured all of them. The interesting thing, I didn't really know much about baitworm. A little bit from my project, but not a lot, like how much it does generate to the economy and stuff. But it started around the 1920s in Wiscasset. And these baitworms were sold down in New York, New Jersey for saltwater sport fishing. And here's a couple of the species. So I figured I'd quickly go through these graphs. So this is the total landings. And if you could see how much money it brings into the state of Maine, it's quite a bit. I mean, this is total landings. And I got this from the DMR website, by the way. And then it breaks it down to the soft-shelled clam. And it's like the price went up, but the landings went down. It's pretty interesting. And then quahogs. And then here's the bloodworm. And also the sandworm. So pretty significant. So I found mudflats being important ecologically. And the reason why I'm interested is that top sentence. They're important foraging areas for gulls, tidal waterfowl, and wading birds and shorebirds. They're utilized year-round. When I was coming in, just driving past Hatch Cove, it was covered with gulls, just hanging out. I'm sure when the water comes in, we'll see black ducks, probably mallards, maybe goldeneye, just some of the buffleheads. They like those small embayments. Mudflats provide storm protection and flood damage. As I mentioned before, they're important for commercial and recreational harvesting opportunities. They assist with pollutant breakdowns, and some are associated with horseshoe crab spawning habitat, not all of them. We're seeing less and less of those. And if you don't know much about horseshoe crabs, their population has declined quite a bit, and primarily because their eggs were used for bait, like down more in New Jersey, Delaware, those areas. They're also used in the biomedical field. Their blood is, is it coagulant? It's used for blood clotting. I'm not going to go through all the species, but as you can see, mudflats are pretty diverse. they're relatively devoid of any sort of vegetation, unless if you get some eelgrass and maybe some algae. But there's quite a few different species that are in the mudflat. And all of these have important ecological linkages. There's a lot of predator-prey relationships, and I'm sure there's some mutualistic stuff going on. But it's pretty surprising. And then the cultural significance, historical uses. We're in Wabanaki ancestral lands, and I don't know how that's pronounced, but I thought it was really cool to add the Passamaquoddy word for mudflat. Their consonants are different, so I wouldn't even attempt it. But mudflats, depending on what literature you look at, they've been used for human use 3,000 to 9,000 years ago, depending on, like I said, where you're looking at. And the reason why we know this is from shell middens. Maine has something like 2,000 sites. We've lost quite a few due to sea level rise and erosion, but there are important links to the past because like some of these shell middens that they found, and some of the more local ones, I think there's one in Blue Hill Falls, and I know there's one in Deer Isle. I don't know if there's any other ones. But they've found bones of great auk and sea mink in these. So it's like, gives us a snapshot of what these areas looked like in the past, what the early people were eating and feeding on and stuff. And then also, I'm going to use Northern Bay and Penobscot as an example because one of the things that they did for a long time is they had 7 brickyards along the bay. Well, when that happened, they were using a lot of the clay to make the bricks. So the habitat became degraded. They dredged out Winslow Cove for shipping. So they were shipping bricks out, bringing goods in. So that disturbs the habitat itself, and then trees were cut. So if you were on Route 15 up in Orland, you could see clear down to Northern Bay. There was not a tree in sight. So if you can imagine what that did for runoff into the bay, and probably back then they weren't really looking into like typhoid and cholera in the mud flats, so I'm sure there was a lot of stuff that was going into, and so that was a long time. These brickyards were from the 1800s to the 1940s. And then I just found some old pictures from the Maine Memory Network of clammers. I thought it was pretty cool to throw in there. It's hard work. I don't know if you've ever seen any, or if you've done any clamming. I don't know how many of you clammed before, but it's not easy work. So some of the environmental issues and threats, of course, there's climate change. We have extreme weather events. So we've been seeing more erratic rain events, which puts a lot of fresh water into these marine systems. Not so much up here, but in Casco Bay, ocean acidification has been impacting the clam population. So all the calcium-based organisms, and I'll get into the Carophium voluntator, which was what my project was on, is also a calcium-based, and some of these, prey organisms will be really impacted if this keeps happening. We've been seeing sea temperatures rising, sea levels rising. And then, of course, we get into pollution, the eutrophication of lawn fertilizers running into the water. When I worked at DMR, I worked for the shellfish sanitation program, so I got to learn so much more about mudflats that I didn't think I knew about. And fecal coliform is a huge problem. It makes you sick. And believe it or not, there are still septic systems that aren't functioning properly, the one in Penobscot in particular, and that's why Northern Bay is still closed, most of it. A lot of runoff from livestock, so big farms, mammal poop, human poop, dog poop, really bad for mudflats. And then wildlife. So one of the problems we were having is Canada geese were congregating in this one area, and it was elevating the levels of fecal coliform in this one spot down east. And it was due to folks feeding the geese. And so we told them a couple of reasons why we discourage it is for avian influenza, and also because people wanted to clam there and they were unable to because of these high counts. Oil spills are always a threat on the coast of Maine. Heavy metals. I was managing a grow area in Eastport, and an interesting thing, they wanted to open this, I think it was Broad Cove. And I don't know if you know what pearling is, but they take fish scales and they put it in makeup and makes it all shiny and glittery. So there was a pearling facility on Broad Cove, but there was also arsenic and other stuff. And I kind of advised against it, opening those flats. I'm not sure where it was at because I left DMR before that happened. But there's a lot of that stuff on the coast. Shoreline development is probably one of the biggest issues and threats for habitat loss and degrade. Not like in the mudflat, but the borders of the mudflat. It really impacts that environment. And of course, dredging. And then here's some of the non-native, and you folks probably are well aware of. And I got this from the University of Maine. Invasive species website. Green crab is a huge issue. Right now, we're monitoring for Asian shore crab. I think it's as far as Scudic, if I remember correctly. They've seen some up there. It's originally from southern Russia, Hong Kong, and a lot of these little critters make it in ship ballast waters. They empty out in the harbors and stuff like that. So, and I was reading about green crabs. They've been monitoring this since the early 1900s when it came into Maine. And how they eradicated or tried to eradicate it in the 60s was pretty interesting. So they tried trapping, fencing, electric fencing, dragging, and poison. So yeah, the 60s, it was kind of a free-for-all for that stuff. But I did want to talk a little bit about the Entomorpha, or the ulva species, the green slime. It is from the North Atlantic, but what they've been finding, it grows well in eutrophic conditions. So those areas that have high inputs of phosphorus, nitrogen, and everything. And it's covering mudflats, and it's really wreaking havoc with the clams. It has a rapid nutrient uptake, so it's depleting resources from those areas. It's choking out the clams. It also produces hydrogen sulfide in the mudflat and anoxic conditions. So it's just not good. It disrupts foraging, wading birds. But it's very tolerant of salinities, and it can be found in freshwater environments. So it's like it can go a lot of places. And here's just a couple of pictures on the upper left that you can see it's the green crab, male and female, and then took pictures of the Asian shore crab just in comparison. And then there's the mat of the Entomorpha. And then you can't quite see it, but there's like juvenile clams in there. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize that it's really not good for these mudflats or the clams. So conservation and management, we collaborate with all these folks, state, federal, landowners, academic institutions like yourself, non-governmental organizations, local, state, regional partners and stakeholders. We also do on-the-ground restoration. I did come up with one study that was done in Jonesport where they took dredge material from one area in Jonesport and put it in another area to do a mudflat construction. And they found that it was actually populated with all the invertebrates over time, that it was successful. I don't recommend that just because of the pollutants and all the stuff that could end up in a mudflat, and they're just transporting it. If there's an invasive species, it's just not good management. And then some municipalities have actually come up with their own mudflat management plans. Taunton Bay has one. I think Frenchman Bay has one. So they're seeing this important resource. So here's me, and this is where I'm drawing where I come from, mud. This is my project that I started. As I said, I started doing shorebird surveys back in 1994 in Maine. I've surveyed the whole coast. A grad student from University of Maine took up a feeding ecology shorebird project. So what I decided to do was write a grant. So I received a state wildlife grant to study the relative abundance and diversity of marine benthic macroinvertebrates on two very productive, low disturbance mudflats in Washington County. And again, when I was working for Department of Marine Resources, this shellfish sanitation program, I learned a different aspect of these mudflats and what was going on as far as water quality. They were looking for the fecal coliform in the water column, and then the biotoxin sampling. We were keeping track of pseudonychiae, which causes red tides when they are in their harmful algal blooms. So this is the predator. Doesn't look like a predator, does it? The semi-palmated sandpiper was our species of interest. It's a species of greatest concern, conservation need rather. It's a priority 2. And we captured them and fit them with nanotags, which was part of the modus. Again, keeping track of the population, their movements. They're only here in Maine for a few weeks. They bulk up. They either double or triple in size, feeding on the mudflats, and then they head to South Central America to the winter. Range top part up in Canada around Hudson Bay, Alaska. And then they just use us as a stopover point, usually on their southern migration where they bulk up on the mudflats and feed. And then from Maine, they usually take a straight shot down to Central and South America on their migration. So it's pretty intense migration. And here's a few of the foraging strategies of the shorebirds and their different bill sizes and what they're feeding on. So this is my study that I did back in 2014. It's a invertebrate food availability study in high quality habitats with low human disturbance. So I did 20 mud core samples 3 times before the shorebirds arrived, during peak migration, and after migration. So I had the 4 transects set up from high water mark to low tide. One of the mudflats was smaller, so it fit the transect, but then Flat Bay was huge, so it was only a little subset of it. Then I sieved the samples and placed them in ethanol rose bangle and counted and identified as best as I could under a microscope back in the lab. So this area is, even though my study site is in that small spot, this whole area is an important international shorebird feeding area. And like I said, with our wildlife management areas, we've been buying up parcels around this area to keep access, to keep development from not happening. So along the Pleasant River from Addison all the way down and all in Flat Bay and that whole area. And then this is like an up-close shot of my transects where I collected the core samples. So these are, down east mudflats have the critical prey resources such as the marine amphipods, polychaetes, and aleketes for migratory shorebirds. Thousands of shorebirds are traveling from the Arctic to our flats here in Maine. They usually show up around mid-July. And the peak migrations from mid-July to probably mid-September, and they linger a little bit longer after that, but once they leave here, they fly nonstop, like I said, down south. And they're usually on these mudflats about 2 to 3 weeks, and the Corophium volitator, which is the amphipod that I was looking into, are high in fatty acids and omegas, and that's what makes them bulk up so quickly. And this is the prey. This is the Corophium volitator. That's actually a male. The reason why I can tell is it has the longer 2 legs in the front, and that helps it feed and grab onto the females during mating season. This is the most abundant benthic macroinvertebrate in the mudslide. They're in the North Atlantic region, restricted to the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy. So that's what makes this an important food source. Their elusive lifestyle makes them difficult to study. Their life histories, their densities, their vulnerabilities. We do know that they can take different temperatures and salinities when the tide's coming in and out. They live in burrows, usually like about 15 centimeters under the mud. And they're like U-shaped tubes that they hang out. They're suspension detritus eaters. They glean and filter most of the diatoms and other bacteria located on or in the mud. They can produce 1 or 2 cohorts during their breeding season, which is May through September. So you can see with shorebirds, it kind of fits. And I have read some places they've seen that they can do a 3rd cohort depending on the weather and the conditions. And like I said before, they are vulnerable to ocean acidification. They are a calcium-based organism. A couple other things that can impact them is ice scouring in the winter months. Bioturbation of the top layer of mud really affects them. Intensive bloodworm and clam harvesting. Major storm events, especially ones with heavy rain and flooding. Infection outbreaks, parasites, pollution, and heavy metals. And they also get preyed upon by fish. So when the tide's in, fish will eat them. A lot going on with these guys. So this is kind of from my data that I found. And on the y-axis, you could see that's meters from the high tide mark going to the low tide mark. And then the bottom on the x-axis is the visits. FB means Flat Bay, MR means Mill River. Those are my 2 sites. You could see, though, really wasn't quite a relationship until that 3rd visit. And that's when we noticed, like, oh yeah, these shorebirds really deplete a mud flat, especially more so in Mill River. Flat Bay was kind of hard because the assemblages are, they're just all over the place on that mud flat. And here's just a dot plot, pretty much saying the same thing. Some things that I noticed, many of the gravid females, so the females with eggs, were observed in the 1st visit, not so much in the 2nd or 3rd. Large males were also observed in that 1st visit, not so much in the other 2. And as you can see, the third visit really diminished the population. So it could be a lot of things happening. It could not just be the shorebirds that are eating it. It could be a temperature thing. We're just not sure, but it gave us at least a little bit of a snapshot to see what was going on in these mudflats. And this is just the average number of individual invertebrates per sample at the 2 sampling sites. So this data collected can make important management decisions regarding protecting critical feeding mudflats for the migratory shorebirds. Calculations can be made, and available prey resources in areas of high numbers of feeding shorebirds. Invertebrate composition and density changes can be tracked in future studies. Comparisons and prey composition of densities can be lower at feeding areas with highly productive mudflats. Sorry. And this is what I was looking at in the microscope. That upper right-hand one is actually a pelagic Gamma-Ridian amphipod. I just thought it was cool. But you can see, like in my petri dish, there's a lot of polychaetes. The one in the middle is a clamworm, and they pinch. And then the lower left hand is actually a female corophium. And I don't know if you could see the egg masses underneath it, but there's like little kind of circle of things. And then the photo on the other side, those are all males. And that's the rose bengal that's making them red, you know, that makes them pop out when I was looking at them in the microscope. And as usual, I get nervous and I talk really fast, but hopefully I filled most of the time. Did I? Okay, awesome.
Is this on? Can you hear me on this? Yes? Okay, great. We do have time for a few questions, so if anybody has questions, I'm going to come up, Patrick and then Dom.
I was wondering if you have any suggestions for ways marine biologists could branch out into avianary studies or research?
Yep. I think I was talking to you. Experience is really important. You can reach out to my department. We do look for interns. For folks who are graduating, Department of Marine Resources, and my department will be hiring a lot of positions in the next couple of years, so keep your eyes out. You guys are in a great program. You're poised to get a job almost immediately, especially if you have that small vessel operation. It's key. I do a lot of boat operations for my job. I did a lot of boat operations for Department of Marine Resources, so you guys have that upper edge compared to most folks who are going out in the field after graduation.
Hello. I know salt marshes and mudflats can be in the same area sometimes. What's the difference between the two?
Well, the salt marsh is the lower marsh is intertidal, but the salt marsh itself is, it will get inundated by the king tides or super high tides, but generally they're mostly dry areas, so they're more like an upland edge of a system.
I have a question about commercial fishing.
Sure.
So I wanted to know, as commercial fishing starts to grow, is there higher impacts on the mudflats? And is regulations becoming more strict on commercial fishing?
I believe so. I think if more and more people, I know like certain towns have limits on how many clams they can pick. I'm not sure if they've seen an uptick in that in recent years, but I think it will impact it if there's a lot of clammers and bait worm harvesters out there.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Join me again saying thank you to Chris West. And I'm sure if anybody wants to ask a question 101, Chris will be up here for a minute or two afterwards, so don't hesitate. Thank you so much, everybody.